Hi everyone, this is Bill from Overtime History, and today we're going to be going over the time that the United States brought 500,000 enemy troops to US soil. That's bigger than the populations of some of the states at that time. That's absolutely an insane number. They literally, if these troops wanted to, they could have taken over a whole entire state. And they didn't. And we're going to go over why they didn't, where they were kept, and what they did with them during this time frame. For a little bit of context, now, the time I'm speaking of specifically is in World War II. But to get there, we got to go back in history. We're going to go back to probably about the 1600s. We're going to see during the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia would come out of that. And because of that, most prisoners would be expected to be released and sent home at the end of the war. Prior to this, it was mostly either you were getting executed, there was a ransom system, where if you were important enough, you would get ransomed. If you were a farmer or blacksmith's son, well, good luck with that. As we move forward and we see that the Enlightenment comes along, people realize there should be more rights for people. We see better treatment, we should say, than there was. Now, it wasn't perfect, quite a ways up until about the 1700s, the 1800s. Prisoner treatment could vary quite drastically. We see during the American Revolution that the prisoner of war system was very ad hoc, meaning it was mostly due to generals communicating with each other on varying sides of, I'll treat your guys this way, you treat my guys this way, and we'll have a fair time until we trade them back. But that could also lead to some people not treating them the right way, and prisoners could not know what to expect. We move a little bit forward to the American Civil War, and we see there that we get General Order 100. General Order 100 basically defined the minimums of what was allowed for POW treatment. And the standards were set fairly well and actually afforded the prisoner quite a few rights during this time. But you got to remember, the American Civil War was strictly a civil war, meaning that it was brother on brother. So literally, you could be fighting your neighbor, and even though he was your enemy, that's always been your neighbor. You're not really going to want to just harm the guy, torture the guy, do all those things to him. You're going to want to treat him well, because at the end of this war, he's still going to be your neighbor, even if he's in another country. Just because there's the line between America and Canada doesn't mean that there's not two neighbors right across the border. So you see a lot nicer of a treatment. Yeah, there were exceptions with camps like Andersonville in the South and things like that. Some people might attribute that to just poor Confederate treatment of Union troops. Others would say that it was more logistical. I'm more inclined to believe that, just due to being the South had a very hard time procuring health needs, bandages, medicines, all those things, getting foods, clothing, just for their own troops. So when a mass amount of Northern troops ended up in these camps, how do you take care of them when you can't even take care of your own guys? I'm sure they tried what they could, but there comes a point when it's just not beneficial to your own troops and your own people to keep doing this. So while they probably could have done better, absolutely. Was it all their fault? I don't think so. But to continue on, then we go on to the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War was a very short war. The Spanish-American War spanned from April 21st to August 12th. So really, it was a very, very short war. There was no need for long-term storage of these prisoners of war. We had about 150,000 enemy troops, give or take, as POWs during the Spanish-American War. But being such a short war, there was no need to ship them anywhere or do anything. They stayed relatively close to the front. From there, we get on to World War I. World War I, again, America said it was neutral most of the war, It kind of was, but there was a lot of mercantile trading and things like that with the Allied powers, a lot more favoritism to them. But they weren't actually in the war, meaning they didn't have the troops ready to go to war exactly when it started, so they had to get that going. They had to get them shipped over there, all that. So it took quite some time. By the time we get over there and they start being in combat and things like that, we only end up seeing them getting a few thousand prisoners. So we'd only see a few thousand prisoners end up back in US soil during that time. Not a very big amount. There's not really a lot of logistics to feeding a few thousand people and things like that. And they were treated relatively well. They ended up working in canneries and local food processing plants, lumber, you know, the typical places you might see a lack of manpower during wartime, because obviously the men are going off to war and they would have held these jobs prior to that. Then we end up at World War II. Finally, what we started talking about in the beginning. So in World War II, America didn't join until partway into the war. But there was no need to worry. Japan airmailed our invitation to Pearl Harbor, and we responded in kind with 2 sons later on. Because of their nice invitation, we got to go play in Germany for a little bit. And during that time, we would see a whole bunch of enemy troops needing a place to go. In 1942, actually, prior to most of the US's prisoners of war needing to be shipped over here, the United Kingdom actually ran out of space for their prisoners. So they were like, hey, US, you got a whole bunch of land over there. You mind taking a few of these guys? And so we would end up seeing a trickle of soldiers start into the United States during this period. Now, when we see the African campaign, Operation Torch and all that, we start to capture prisoners of war from the Africa Corps and the 1st and 10th Italian armies. Once those guys were captured, they couldn't stay right near the front lines like during the Spanish-American War. It wasn't that short of a war. This was a longer war, so we had to figure out what to do with them. So within a few weeks to a few months of being captured, these prisoners would find themselves being shipped back to the United States on what they would call Liberty ships. Liberty ships were ships that were bringing soldiers and supplies to the front, to the United Kingdom and places like that, but they were going back empty. So they're like, well, we got all these guys to go back, so just put them back in the ships that were sending back empty. Problem solved. So as these prisoners come back, they'd end up in about 3 different ports when they show up. They'd either show up in Virginia, New York, or Boston. And when they'd show up there, there was about 500 or so main camps, 200 or so branch camps, but we're going to say 700 POW camps that they would be sent to from there. What we would end up seeing is in the South, the POW camps would pop up and spring up a lot quicker. Some of them would start up from older military installations that were already there, not really used that much, and some of them would be built rapidly. And when they built these camps, there was not much difference from them in a regular military installation, honestly. Many military installations at the time were made out of tar paper, plywood, corrugated tin, you know, like you would find in a regular Quonset hut today. And so, like, they wasn't bad, necessarily. One prisoner actually said something along the lines of, we were so impressed that we had a blanket, a pillow, and a bed, and some good meals that we basically thought we were at the Hilton. So once these prisoners would go from there, eventually they would start moving prisoners up north, too, as we'd get more of them. There were a few complications moving prisoners to northern camps. It was mostly the climate that was the issue. You would see that, you know, the cold weather, food, things like that were just a little bit harder to get and a little bit harder to navigate up there. But eventually, prisoners would move up there. And this whole time, these prisoners are kind of worried because they've heard all these terrible stories about how Americans treat their POWs, you know, between beating, sometimes just killing them straight. Like, they thought they could die at any moment. Half of them are ending up to these camps and finding, oh, this is basically just chilling out at a barracks. Like, this ain't terrible. Eventually, though, the United States would be looking more at putting them into the workforce, which was kind of already their plan to begin with. which was good because what we would see as these guys are showing up is the civilians are kind of getting a little nervous and rambunctious. What they're seeing is guys who just weeks, months before were literally trying to kill their own sons, husbands, brothers, and now they're being brought next door. And for a lot of them, that was a big concern. Now, for farmers and sawmill owners, what they saw was men who could do labor that couldn't be done by the local populace due to half the working force being off in World War II or off filling other roles needed to support the war effort. You would also see the government come up with the Rosie the Riveter campaign and other campaigns of the sort to try to help the workforce issues. But that wasn't the only thing. See, part of the good meals that these prisoners were talking about was kind of controversial because the civilians, a lot of them were kind of feeling the restrictions of war. We're starting to see rationing. We're starting to see, the government encouraging being careful with how you use things. And while they see these prisoners of war being treated relatively well. But this comes from the laws and stuff that came before. We touched on the Treaty of Westphalia and General Order 100. After that, we would end up seeing the Hague Conventions. Now, the Hague Conventions really would set the standard for how prisoners would be treated. Specifically, the 1907 one was the last one to happen before World War I. The basis of this was basically prisoners had to be given the same food, the same housing that you would afford your own troops, basically, a depot troop. They had to be given medical aid. They had to be given work that wasn't related directly to the war effort, and they weren't supposed to be forced necessarily to work. You would see that prisoners were even kind of allowed to attempt to escape, or the regulation, because in the regulation, it set the precedent that these prisoners could escape, and during the attempt of them escaping, they could be harmed or injured or killed even. But once they were captured, you couldn't do anything really more to these prisoners other than mild punishment. Like, they were basically just supposed to be returned to be like, oh, don't do that again. And you see that the guards aren't allowed to beat prisoners and things like that. Overall, relatively good treatment is required. And you see in World War II that at American POW camps, that really was held to, which even upset the locals, but really made the prisoner population fairly docile. There weren't a lot of riots or anything crazy, but you see elsewhere, especially on the Axis side, not great treatment for the prisoners of war. Now, I can't say that things didn't happen on the Allied side, but we see high propensity for forced labor, abuse of prisoners, executions between the Germans, Japanese, and things like that. So going back to our prisoners of war that are now in America, they're chilling out. What are they doing here? Well, while they're here, actually, they're not treated poorly at all. They actually have access to college-level education. They have access to sports teams as far as like they're having their own competitions. They're playing soccer or football, as Europeans might call it. They're playing baseball. They're fencing and doing all the things that they would almost normally do. And then the United States offers to prisoners that aren't causing issues the chance to basically go work for a form of money. They were paid in chits. Chits were basically just a made-up currency that the United States came up with to give these guys to basically spend at the camp commissary. And there they could buy things like candies, cigarettes, and whatnot. They would use these prisoners in different places like lumber camps, food processing places, up at ice cutting camps in rural areas. And they were allowed a lot of freedom in these times. A lot of these prisoners speak of the guards not even really caring mostly. They would talk of sometimes throwing rocks at towers. So Hans Kruger says, who was a prisoner of Holton, Maine camp, the guards were very lax. You could watch them sleeping and dozing in the daytime. We would throw small pebbles or stones against the guard towers. Sometimes it would take 10 minutes to wake them up. Basically, this is babysitting with guns. Like, these guys just had zero craps to give. It's the substitute teacher that came in and put on a movie for the day. These prisoners would end up working in these farms and in these factories, and since they weren't really guarded, they'd end up becoming quite friendly with the locals and developing friendships that would last a lot of them lifetimes. But in that, it would also leave room for some of these prisoners to make their escape attempts. Some of these are pretty good attempts. Some were actually successful, and others were ended within days and hours. Let's look into why they did those. Why they made these escape attempts. We've been talking about how great these prisoners of war camps are and how great these guys were treated. Why would they want to escape from it? Well, towards the end of the war, we start seeing that they're hearing that, hey, you're going to be shipped back home. Well, but your home is now in Russia because Russia took the territory that your home used to be in. And Russia has fun little things called gulags. They're nice little camps where you go and work for the rest of your life till you don't wake up. And a lot of those guys were afraid of that. They'd heard of different workplaces and workforces they might be sent to before they could go home that had harsh treatments. And some of them just had nothing to go home to. Their homes were blown up and burnt out, and why go home to a family that's not there anymore? They saw how great America was, or what they saw to be America and how great they thought it was. And so they wanted to stay, or some of them just really were that passionate about Germany and its cause that they wanted to escape and return to the fight because they thought they had something to give that could help the rest of the war effort. First, we'll start with one of the best known stories, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher his name, so please forgive me in the comments. I'm going to read it so I don't screw it up here. George Gartner. He was captured by British troops and sent to the US. I'm going to call him George for the sake of I'm terrible at my German here. George basically came up with the crazy idea that, hey, there's a train that goes by all the time, every time, at a specific time. I'm going to sneak under 2 fences, 2 gates, get out of here, get onto that train, which he successfully does. George would end up going on to be part of a ski rescue where there was a train that was lost in the mountains. And they're like, hey, we need a group of guys to go do this. And for some reason, they picked the German-speaking guy. And we're like, yeah, this seems normal. Just a German guy right after World War II here. Like, yeah, let's send him to go be the hero when they were just kind of the baddies. Kind of a strange thing to pick. They do the whole rescue, and then they take a lovely picture of George's face and plaster it on the news. Now, George is actually wanted by the FBI at this point. George is on one of their most wanted lists, and nobody ever catches on. Like, this whole thing goes to the news. He's a hero. Nobody ever notices, hey, he's the prisoner that escaped all these years ago. He goes on, gets a social security number, does a whole bunch of different jobs, he's a ski instructor and a whole bunch of other things, has a wife, and they live a nice, happy life. Pretty much like he got away with it, and you'd think that was the end of the story. But eventually, his wife starts getting grumpy. Most people, when they get older, are like, hey, you know what? I got all this money saved. I want to travel. I want to go see and do things. But poor George here, he can't get a passport. Eventually, she's about ready to leave. She's just done with it. She's like, I want to live my life. And George has to fess up that, hey, I escaped the prisoner of war camp. And she's like, George, honey, it's years later. Nobody cares. Just go turn yourself in. Which George does, and eventually ends up becoming a US citizen well into the 2000s. So, a pretty good story for him. There's a great Papago escape where 25 prisoners would escape on December 23rd, 1944. All of them would end up being apprehended fairly quickly. So it was a terrible escape. I don't know what they were doing. How can so many of you get caught that quickly? We got George here who escaped, literally was in the news and didn't get caught, and you guys get caught within weeks. Like, sorry if any of you are alive and watching this, you're all failures of escapees. Just saying. Now we're gonna go to probably my most favorite story that I found. It's of a camp in northern Maine. It's an ice cutting camp. And there were 3 German dudes who decided one day that we have to escape. And you'd think that their escape would be if they wanted to go fight for Germany, they wanted to escape terrible prisoner conditions, or they wanted to escape and get into their own lives here in America, you know, like go forge their own American adventure. And it's none of those. The reason these guys wanted to escape was they couldn't stand the bugs in Maine during the summer again. They ended up literally risking their lives to avoid the mosquitoes and black flies of the Maine woods. Their names, Frank, Hurst, and Antone. On March 7th, the nice balmy temperature of 23 degrees out, thought they were going to make it to the Maine coast to catch a freighter to go back to Germany to avoid our bugs. So they go ahead, they steal 3 axes, they get themselves a couple of handmade knives, and they get a map and compass that they made, and they set off into the woods. And so they get going and they completely disappear. They can't find them. Now, this is not really a good show for the camp because just weeks before, they had an inspection and they were kind of like, hey, your camp is kind of lacking security. And they're like, don't worry about it. And they're like, no, we should be worried about it. This is a POW camp. And he's like, no, you don't understand. This is the Maine woods. Now, the Maine woods were already it was kind of a myth, but it was still terrifying because these prisoners of war had heard that we still had natives in our woods. They thought that Native Americans were going to come out and scalp them. But even though they thought that was going to happen, they were still more afraid of our insects. So they went ahead and they made this escape. But they didn't get very far. See, they would come into the Maine woods and it would take them quite a while, but they'd head off towards an area that's called Five Forks. And during this time, the warden service, all sorts of different services throughout the state would get together and try to capture these guys. We're talking planes, dogs, troops, all on the ground looking for these prisoners. Nobody could find them. The law enforcement agencies of the area, they actually knew of a local hermit, Bill Hall. Now, Bill had been there, I want to say almost 2 decades in that woods. Like, he knew the woods like the back of his hand. But these law enforcement agents were too afraid to go talk to old Bill because Bill was a hermit and liked to be alone. And they called him specifically Prickly. Now, back then they called it Prickly. I think we have a different word for it now, but I can't say that for YouTube community guideline reasons. But I'll let you use your imagination on that one. So anyway, they end up giving up and they're like, we're going to go talk to Bill. Like, Bill's going to figure it out. And sure enough, Bill's like, yeah, you guys are dumb. They're heading to Five Forks. And they're like, how do you know that? And Bill's just like, that's just how the terrain's going to lead them. Like, you guys are stupid. Sure enough, 2 officers go heading that way. They quickly get on the tracks of these guys and capture them. This is when they find out why they did it and they bring the troops back. And honestly, only one of them that I saw ended up getting really any sort of punishment, so to speak, but basically it was just put into solitary for 4 days. And I think it was more so because they stole the knives and the axe than it was that they posed any real threat or they were worried about them trying to escape again. Plus, they realized how bad the woods were the first time, they might as well just stay put. This would finally bring an end to what we would call the Great Invasion of World War II. And we can see that there's quite a stark comparison between how the Allies, specifically the US, would treat their prisoners of war and how it would really affect how the prisoners of war viewed America after. And it would also really affect their lives. Some of them would actually return into to live and work in America after being sent home because they just ended up liking it here so much. Well, I hope that sparked your curiosity, guys. I hope you had a good time, and we'll catch you all next time. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow, and see you soon.